Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Congress shall make no law. We're already going to stop there. Because Congress was, at this point in time, the only branch of government with any legislative power, it was assumed that naming Congress specifically in this amendment would cover the idea that government should not take part in religion or religious practices. However, both executive orders and judicial review were established very early on in our government's history, progressing the powers of each branch respectively. It was assumed that Congress, in this case, would be expanded to encompass all federal government bodies when looking at this amendment. When the Bill of Rights was expanded to the states through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, this meaning was extended even further to all government bodies. The Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution and Bill of Rights intentionally vague so that it could be interpreted differently based on how the government changed or how social views progressed. Ultimately, the Supreme Court has the power to interpret these laws, and many court cases have come from the First Amendment. Respecting an establishment of religion. This phrase is known as the Establishment Clause, and it can be broken up into three major points, all dealing with the government's relation with religion. 1. The government cannot establish any number of official religions. This does not mean that the government ignores the existence of religions. With this definition, they accept their existence but avoid the responsibilities that come with one or more national religions. The government is stepping out of these responsibilities and leaving it up to the people. This is what we call the wall of separation. 2. The government cannot give preferential treatment to one religion over another. Although the government created the wall of separation, it was impossible to fully avoid any legislation that dealt with religion. In order to deal with this, the Founding Fathers ensured that every religion would be considered equally in the eyes of the law. Third, the Founding Fathers guaranteed that no religion or non-religion would be favored over the other when creating laws. In the Supreme Court case, Lemon v. Kurtz, a test was created to ensure that the Establishment Clause was upheld. This test had three parts. The first part was that the primary purpose of the assistance must be secular. The second part is the assistance will not promote or hinder religion. And the third part was that there will be no excessive entanglement between the church and the state. I'm sure some can already spot the difficulty with this test. Who judges the primary purpose of the assistance, especially when laws have so many additional provisions added just to pass nowadays? Who judges how a law will affect a religion until it happens, and who is there to ensure that no law will do so indirectly? How is the term excessive entanglement defined legally and held to the exact same definition every time? Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This part of the First Amendment is known as the Free Exercise Clause. This clause establishes the people's relation with religion. It was officially defined by the government as follows. The Free Exercise Clause protects citizens' right to practice their religion as they please, so long as the practice does not run afoul of public morals or a compelling government interest. This wording establishes the idea that certain activities under the umbrella term of religion are not allowed. These certain scenarios are not protected under the First Amendment's right to religion. An example of this is the practice of human sacrifice. This practice both runs afoul of public morals, as the taking of another person's life is typically not accepted in the average American home, and also directly compels the government's interest, as they typically aim to keep American citizens alive. Since I last checked, murder and assisted suicide in any form other than medical is still a crime under United States law. And breaking the law in any way is technically compelling a government interest. This is, however, a gray area. Certain laws are allowed to be broken if a person claims religious beliefs, while others aren't. The deciding factor is typically the religious claim's interaction with other people. A person who wants to practice human sacrifice is doing so by interacting and harming another person. We have established laws against the harming of others and murder. However, if a state were to say, pass a law requiring everybody to eat a waffle every Tuesday, and a person's religious beliefs held them from eating waffles at all, it can be reasonably assumed that they would get a religious exemption from the waffle tyranny. However, in a case such as religious exemptions to immunizations, there has been some debate as to where it falls on the spectrum. At this point in time, vaccines are mandatory for all children in all 50 states. However, many claim exemptions for their children from these laws for many religious reasons. The primary purpose for vaccines is to prevent widespread disease in our country. Because of this, questions are brought up regarding the legitimacy of these exemptions. One side's argument is that they should be able to control what they put in their bodies or their children's bodies. Many religions vouch for the control of substances that are put into one's bodies, such as alcohol, drugs, or foreign substances. On the other side, does this refusal to immunize create a safety risk for everyone else? If so, then should refusing to immunize based on religious principles be considered running afoul of public morals? This runs along with the idea of allowing for interpretation. This gray area that has been created based on the wording of the First Amendment and Supreme Court opinions allow these issues to change or evolve over time based on public opinion. The idea of religious views versus state laws has been brought up a few times, such as in the case of Wisconsin v. Yoder, where state laws that inhibited religious practices were challenged. In Wisconsin v. Yoder, the question of religious exemption of education was brought up. The Yoders were an Amish family who attempted to take their kids out of school after 8th grade, while Wisconsin required all kids to stay in school until at least the age of 16. Did Jonas Yoder have the ability to take his kids out of school after the 8th grade based on the fact that his kids would be exposed to teachings contrary to their religion? The court ruled in his favor, allowing his kids to be taken out of school and establishing that his religious views sometimes outweigh the laws of the state. Typically, the protection of religion has increased over time, such as in the cases shown. However, there have been a few cases where the freedom of religion has actually decreased. One thing that has been established throughout history is that the right to freely practice religion applies to the people of the United States as well as the religious bodies themselves. These religions typically have a few characteristics, such as written text, belief in a higher power, or structural hierarchy. These religions have the power to gather freely, display religious symbols, and freely express their beliefs, as long as it is on private property that the religious group owns or is allowed to demonstrate on. Or abridging the freedom of speech. Arguably the most discussed of the freedoms in the First Amendment, the freedom of speech does just that, gives people the right to freely exchange their beliefs and ideas. However, not all speech is protected. In this following section, we will ask ourselves these questions. What are the differences of protected speech versus unprotected speech? What kind of speech is not protected? What are the types of speech, and how has the ability of speech changed over time? The types of speech are as follows. 1. Political speech. Political speech is one of the most crucial forms of speech in our country. Most speech that deals with the government can be considered political speech, even if it was directly against the government. In our history, political speech has been protected almost to a fault. Most Supreme Court cases that deal with political speech end up ruling in favor of the increase in the protection of political speech. This was proven during the case of Brandenburg v. Ohio. In this case, a KKK member held a speech in a public location and was challenged for doing so. The Supreme Court ended up ruling in the Klan member's favor, almost ensuring the protection of any form of political speech. 2. Hate speech. Hate speech, a term used in cases such as violent words or demonstrations, is usually protected by the First Amendment. However, this is not the case for intimidation. If hate speech is accompanied by some form of intimidation, then it is not protected. Hate speech is also different than a hate crime. Hate speech is words that incite hatred against a certain group for many reasons, such as race, gender, religion, or something else. A hate crime is an unlawful act based on these same categories. Number 3. Symbolic speech. Symbolic speech is usually protected by the First Amendment. Symbolic speech is any type of speech that includes nonverbal or non-written communication. This can include flag burning, draft card burning, wearing armbands, or other things. Symbolic speech is not protected when it threatens public order or governmental interest. For example, burning draft cards to encourage people to not register for the draft, or burning a flag in a public location that could cause further damage or harm to people. In the Supreme Court case of Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, symbolic speech was challenged. In this case, students wore black armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War, despite being told that they would be punished for it. The Supreme Court decided that students can express their opinions through political speech as long as it does not harm the learning environment. Number 4. Commercial speech. Commercial speech is typically less protected than other forms of speech. Commercial speech refers to any speech regarding commerce in any way. An important case that deals with commercial speech is Central Hudson v. Public Service Commission. This case established that the government can regulate commercial speech under the First Amendment if there is a substantial government interest that is directly advanced by the regulation, and if the regulation is not broader than necessary to achieve that goal. This establishes a four-part test. 1. The government must have a proper reasoning as to why they are attempting to limit the speech. This essentially means that the commercial speech has to be misleading or false in some way. 2. The evidence that the government has for limiting the speech is enough to constitute a law limiting the speech. 3. The law that they pass must directly affect the regulation of the speech and nothing else. 4. The regulation of speech cannot be more than what is necessary to limit the speech. The fifth type of speech is libel or obscenity. Libel is defined as any form of defamation that is written down and actively works to harm the reputation of another person due to false statements. For much of our history, libel in any form was illegal. In the 1964 decision in New York Times v. Sullivan, there was an added requirement for libel to be unprotected speech. Malicious intent was necessary for libel to be illegal. The citizen's right to speak freely against government officials or public figures was supposed to be protected under the First Amendment, and the idea that writing down ideas that pushed against these figures would be illegal seemed contradictory. Obscenity is the use of lewd or dirty words or pictures. Typically, obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. However, there are some protections that this type of speech has. A test for obscenity must evaluate the entire work that the obscene speech is in. If the entire work is determined to have some purpose, whether for artistic, literary, educational, or other value, then the obscene speech would be protected, as it is part of a larger work. This was established in the case of United States v. One Book Called Ulysses. There are a few types of speech that are never protected by the First Amendment. One of the more popular examples of speech that is not protected is fighting words. This type of speech is used to directly incite violence or breach peace. Another example of speech that is not protected is an incitement of a riot. The freedom of expression is not directly stated in the First Amendment, but it is inferred and directly goes along with the freedom of speech. The freedom of expression gives the people the right to freely share opinions and beliefs through the expression of themselves. Very similar to the freedom of speech, which is the expression of beliefs or opinions through words, the freedom of expression includes actions or declarations of oneself. For example, a peace sign, attending a rally, kneeling during the national anthem, and much more. Or of the press. A free press is one of the most important features of our country. It allows for the free exchange of written ideas, the expansion of beliefs, and the widespread access to current news. Limiting the freedom of the press would be limiting the freedom of the people to know what is going on in the United States. The First Amendment strictly prohibits any law that attempts to threaten the freedom of the press. These types of laws are called censorship and are generally frowned upon during the pursuit of a truly free country. One of the more important features of a free press is the ability to criticize the government and expose its wrongdoings. However, censorship in modern-day America is not completely non-existent, nor should it be. Censorship can also protect the people from hearing or seeing things that they probably shouldn't be, such as classified documents regarding national security, gruesome content, or content showing violent crimes. An example of this is posting the plans of the United States military, as an enemy country could gain an advantage by knowing them if they have not happened yet. As a general rule of thumb, posting something that has already happened is usually illegal. Prior restraint is the name given to a federal order to stop speech or press before it happens. The most famous example of this is in the case of New York Times v. United States. In this case, the New York Times was set to publish classified government documents in order to inform the people of the truth of the Vietnam War. The federal government challenged this, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the newspaper, again strengthening the First Amendment. Prior restraint is unconstitutional unless in times of war, times where speech would incite violence, or in issues of national security. This was established in the case of Neer v. Minnesota. In this case, the Supreme Court found that the government cannot block the publication of something before it is first released. This does not, however, protect the publisher from punishment after the publication is released. More limitations to the freedom of press are the creation of material that directly advocates against the government. We've already established that it is a right of the press to publish material that criticizes the government or exposes its wrongdoings, but where is the line that cannot be crossed? In 1917, the Espionage Act was passed, shortly followed by the Sedition Act in 1918. These acts made it a crime to purposefully promote false information that interferes with the activities of the government. These laws were passed in order to keep the support of the people for the United States military effort in the Great War, or World War I. In 1919, these laws were challenged constitutionally in the case of Schenck v. United States. Charles Schenck was a socialist that spread anti-draft propaganda. This encouraged people to not register or obey the draft and directly violated the Espionage Act. Schenck was advocating for peaceful disobedience of the draft, but was eventually arrested. The Supreme Court ruled that both acts were constitutional, as the United States government had increased power during wartime, and that Schenck had violated them. However, the court established the clear and present danger test. This test was created by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. It outlines the requirement for press and speech to no longer be protected, stating that anything published or said threatening a clear and present danger of a crime is illegal. Disobeying the draft was a crime, and Schenck's advocacy for this crime was likely to hinder the successfulness of the conscription process. Holmes compared this act to shouting "fire" in a movie theater falsely, which would incite the disruption of peace in public, which is a crime. In 1940, the Smith Act was passed, making it illegal to advocate for the violent overthrow of the government, or to be a part of a group dedicated to this effort. This act was aimed towards communists and allowed the government to arrest Communist Party members because of the party's radical reputation during this time. In the case of Yates v. United States, this act was weakened by clarifying the definition of "to advocate." After this ruling, only members of these parties that directly advocated a crime were found in violation of the act, once again increasing the power of the First Amendment. The media has changed immensely over time. At the beginning of our country, newspapers, books, and word of mouth were the only sources of news that anybody got. The most famous example of the usage of media during this time was the publishing of the Federalist Papers. The Federalists published these papers in order to gain the public's support for the ratification of the new Constitution. Another use of printed media was Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which revealed the unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry, bringing about changes in food standards in the United States. After written media came radio. Radio allowed instantaneous communication for the first time. President Franklin D. Roosevelt used radio in order to let the public know what was going on in the White House through his fireside chats. Television was the next evolution in media. This helped show the effects of the civil rights movements and helped to make it a nationwide movement. It helped President Kennedy win the election of 1960 as it showed his charming appearance. It has been used as a political medium, such as the speech of Bush after 9/11, to reassure the American people. In modern America, social media is the primary source of news for most people. There has been an increase in the amount of horse race journalism, meaning the tendency of journalists to emphasize how candidates stand in the polls. Most of all, citizen journalism is now one of the biggest influences in the political climate of the United States. Citizen journalism is when the average American captures, records, or reports on an event. Or the right of the people peacefully to assemble. The American people's right to assemble allows the rest of the rights in this amendment to exist on a larger scale. The right of assembly is the right to gather a large amount of people in a public area, usually to change some kind of public policy. Assembly is allowed as long as it does not threaten public policy or peace. An unlawful assembly is the name given to an assembly that does threaten public peace. In order for this term to be given, the common intent of the majority of the people attending the assembly must be to disturb the peace. If an assembly of people come together with a plan to break the law, then it is called a rout. If these people actually go through with breaking the law, it is considered a riot. Unlawful assembly, routs, and riots are all illegal, and participating in any of them is a misdemeanor. In most cases, you do not need a permit in order to assemble or march through public locations. Anybody at any time can peacefully assemble, rally, or march through streets, sidewalks, or other public locations, as long as they do not obstruct the traffic or purpose of that area. If this is the case, a permit will be required. And to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The foundation of our government was built on the consent of the governed. This means that the power of the government comes from the people, and that the people willingly give up some of their freedoms to the government in order to ensure a society that has rules. The freedom of petition highlights this and allows the people of the United States to freely ask the government for change without fear of repercussions or punishments. There are so many ways to petition the government, with some of them being letter writing, public speaking, meeting with a member of the government, and testifying before the government. If a person is to exercise their right of petition, a member of the government is required to hear about it, as long as the petition is serious, realistic, and fair. If a person is to request that blueberry muffins be outlawed on the West Coast, it is not legally required to be heard. Oftentimes, a staff member of a representative will address in-person meetings or letters written. However, there is no requirement for a member of government to respond to a petition. Unfortunately, I am not able to give a history that would even be remotely close to detailed for the right of petition, as there are thousands of examples. In fact, almost every Supreme Court case is an example. Because the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, or the power to review a law's constitutionality if it is challenged, the person who challenges the law is called the petitioner. There are thousands of instances of petitioning the government every day, and every serious petition is equally as important as the next. There are many leaders for the First Amendment, but the main two are Thomas Jefferson and James Madison for setting up the system that is currently in use today. There is always work to be done for the First Amendment, and an increase in the power of the First Amendment is almost always a good thing for the people of the United States. I personally will use my First Amendment rights every day and vouch for others to do the same. Over the course of a few days, I held in-person surveys at 3 locations. The first was a medium-sized city, the next a college campus, and finally a high school campus. This is the form that I used. Here's the data that I found. What I found interesting is that every person who voted in the survey put speech and expression as their #1 right. I also found it interesting that the right of petition was almost dead last at 4th. Here's the second half of the data. What I found interesting is that the majority of people intends to vote in the next election, although this could be skewed by the fact that I asked mainly urban or suburban audiences.